sheriff now for a little over 12 and a half years here. I started my career back in 91. I am the immediate past president of the North Carolina Sheriff's Association, and I now chair our executive committee. I'm also fortunate enough to serve on the Sheriff's Training and Standards Commission, representing District 7 here in North Carolina. So excited to be here and be a part of it. I think when the first meeting occurred, it might have been when we had our aftermath of or approaching hurricane. I'm not sure, so I apologize for missing that. We've had a little bit of damage in our area. It was a little bit more than what we had anticipated, but fortunately no serious injuries or deaths, and so we were blessed in that respect. But again, thank you for letting me be here and be a part of it.
Thank you, Sheriff. Glad to have you, and glad that you're okay. So with that, we'll ask for a motion to approve the minutes from the first meeting. I'll give you just a moment to look over those, and then look for a motion from one of you to approve the minutes so that we can get into the meeting.
I don't think I should make a motion on that at all. I was not a part of it, so I just wanted to fit that out.
Would you mind seconding it? Just
I'll be glad to second it.
all right. So Chief, do you mind making a motion on that?
Yes, I can make that motion. I move that we accept the minutes of the previous meeting as presented.
Thank you so much. We have a motion by Chief Davis. Is there a second, Sheriff?
I'll second it.
Second by Sheriff Ingram. Any discussion on the motion? All those in favor of approval of the minutes, say aye. Aye.
Aye.
All right. And those opposed, there are none. Motion carries. So item number 2 on the agenda, the meeting goals. Certainly, as we talked about during meeting 1, I think we have a very important role and a great opportunity here to have great conversation. Sheriff Ingram, the last time when we had the first meeting, I know you all are very busy, and I like to be respectful of our time. And so we try to send a lot of information ahead of time to read over. Ms. Dismukes, make sure that we stay very studious with that. But during the meetings, we'll try to always have a goal and outcome. And so I think our meeting goals were to establish basically to build better trust and relationships between law enforcement and the community. And so you all having the law enforcement background, is very helpful. We have a legislator here, and then on our end, we have a little closer contact with the local citizenry and the local government perspective. So I think we got to have a great group and a great opportunity to do that. And hopefully I look forward to us coming out with some great recommendations for the overall task force to consider. So thank you for joining us. Thank you for your expertise, and look forward to a great meeting. So with that, I'll turn it over to Ms. Dismukes to review the last meeting.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Okay, I'm going to try to share my screen here. See if I can do this. You guys got I have 3 monitors, so you guys might have the version that has the notes, even though there are no notes. I don't know if y'all can see that. Let's see here. Okay, so I'm not sure how to turn it off the notes thing, so I'll just drag it to the side. This meeting's focus is recruitment and retention. We decided last time that we would divide up our meetings for our 3 subject matter areas: recruitment and retention, training, and accountability and culture, so that we would be able to really drill down on a particular area of focus at each meeting. And so the pre-work that was sent was focused on recruitment and retention specifically, and for this time, and that's what we will try to focus on discussing. Did want to ask one question during this time of Sheriff Ingram. The 4th bullet was enhancement of the law enforcement profession. And I think that that was your response to the survey in terms of what we should focus on. So I didn't know if you wanted to give the group a little bit of an idea of what you meant by that, and if that was encompassed by the three other prongs of what we're working here, or if there's something additional that we should be looking at in terms of our working group.
Yes. Currently with the Sheriff's Association, we have a working group of sheriffs that are focused on enhancing law enforcement professionalism. And I think one way that we can focus on that is through the Sheriff's Training and Standards, working in conjunction with CJ Standards Commissions to ensure that we are focusing our efforts on the training that is needed. Another thing that I see as a potential problem between the two commissions, and I pointed that out at a recent meeting, is the fact that the forms, there are blocks on those forms when a person is either fired, resigns, or whatever it might be, the reason they leave an agency. Those two forms are not consistent at all. The CJ side of it has a section in there that mentions, and I can't remember the exact wording. I don't have it in front of me now. I apologize, but it mentions conduct, whereas the sheriff's side of it simply mentions rules violation or criminal investigation. And I think that we need to have some consistency between those two commissions to ensure that we don't have an officer who falls into that loophole and can leave an agency without an investigation being completed and potentially hire on somewhere else. That is a real problem. So that's one of the areas that I believe that we could focus some effort on with regards to the law enforcement profession. And there's another number of other areas too as well on the commission side of it that we're looking at. Another thing that I see is the lack of standardization with our agencies across the state, whether it's a sheriff's office or a police department. Our agency is accredited. There are a few agencies in the state that are accredited. I think that we were maybe number 5 or 6 as far as sheriff's offices in the state, and there's only like 6 or 7 sheriff's offices that are accredited. I think maybe total agencies in the state would be less than 60 or so. And with the new program that's being proposed by the Criminal Justice Division, it would be a North Carolina based accreditation program. If we could ensure that all of our agencies at least participate in that, and the cost associated with it is very minimal compared to the cost that is required to be a part of the CALEA program, I think that we could get a lot of these agencies up to minimal acceptable standards and hold them accountable with regards to properly reporting potential problematic officers and ensuring that we have thorough background investigations and that information is shared among agencies. So many times one agency will be doing a background on an officer that has applied with them, reach out to a prior agency they were with, and that agency will give them very limited information, if any, at times, which a lot of times doesn't give them a clear understanding as to that officer, who that officer is, or potential issues surrounding them. Then they hire on, and without fail, we've seen where it unfortunately we end up with an issue in our agency or other agencies that hire someone on like this. So I think we need a lot more consistency when it comes to the agencies and how we share this information about these officers. So that's a little bit about where I was going with that.
Okay. Thank you, Sheriff. I think that provides some good context and some good notes for our discussion. So today we'll talk about recruitment and retention, and then our subsequent meeting focuses will be training on 9/17 and then accountability and culture on 10/1. I think there's probably going to be a lot of pre-work that's going to go into the accountability and culture. And I know that we talked about adding a new, an additional meeting. So we have added that additional meeting. I think Angela sent out the invitation for that additional meeting after this to consider the first round of recommendations and then finalize our recommendations for the task force. We are going to have speakers for the other topic areas. Today we have Dr. Patrick Oliver with us, and then we will have speakers for training and accountability and culture also. But if there are specific questions or needs related to these topic areas, please don't hesitate to shoot me an email and just let me know. I can do some research and send out more homework, Chief, when I get the answers to your questions. Another thing for us to focus on and think about while we're going through today is data collection. Overall, the task force perhaps may have a recommendation for certain pieces of data that need to be collected statewide. And so we want to be conscious of, for our group, what types of data do we want to recommend need to be collected throughout this process. And then the pre-work for today's meeting should have included the idea bank review that I sent right after the last meeting. And then the documents that I had earlier this week include Dr. Oliver's article and some IACP documents and some COPS documents. I wanted to get some feedback from y'all to make sure that this is working, sending these documents to you ahead of time via email, that that's still how you prefer to receive the information, that you're having enough time to review them, or if there are any issues with that part of the process.
I think it's helpful to get them ahead of time because, well, the initial documents you've sent, Leslie, you know, they're quite comprehensive, and the time getting them ahead of time has provided us, you know, opportunities to sort of review them before we have an opportunity to have a well-informed meeting. So it's been very helpful for me.
And I probably will do a better job of having them to you even earlier next time, but as Chief Davis knows, we had CJ commission last week, and that ended up taking up the bulk of last week. So I apologize for the delay on that, but I'll try to keep those coming in addition or enough in advance that you guys can have time to review.
Yes, it's helpful to me.
Yes, sir.
I said it's helpful on my end as well. Thank you.
Of course. So a couple of the data questions that came out of the last meeting were what demographic data do the commissions collect? So CJ collects demographic data from training records, but it's still a self-report on the training records. And this is the most recent breakdown that we have from CJ. We do not, to Justice Earle's question, we do not have a breakdown by department. So perhaps if we feel like that is what's helpful, that might be a data suggestion we would have for the ultimate working group, is that we need to have a breakdown by department and by sheriff's office as to the demographic data, because while individual agencies might keep it, there is no overall database. Sheriff's database has race and gender fields, but according to the Director of Sheriff Standards, Diane Konopka, it's about 30% blank. People self-select to not fill it out. And so it's not as helpful as we would like for it to be, because they don't have the same kind of data collection. But again, this data collection that CJ is doing is not mandated by a rule. And as Chief Davis knows, and I think I mentioned last week at CJ, we considered a new rule for collecting BLET data, so that now we approved the commission to collect data on the number of people who start BLET. We have always collected the data of the number of people who finish. So now we'll know the attrition rate. But I confirmed with our staff, our CJ staff, that data does not include demographic data. So again, we just have straight numbers of to look at attrition, but we don't have demographic data there. And again, neither have disaggregated data by department. So as we go through this, that might be something that we consider making a recommendation for data collection out of this working group. Again, additional responses to data questions. The others that you had were about officer-involved shootings and SBI investigations and civilian review boards. And we're still looking into those, and we'll get more information to you on those things, but those will be for later, probably for our accountability and culture discussion on October 1st. So we'll have those to you in enough in advance for that. And then that's all I have for this part of the agenda. I'll wait on the rest of it until we get back to the discussion topics. I think that's all I have for that portion of the agenda, Mayor Coleman.
Thank you, Ms. Dismukes. Next on the agenda, discussion, recruitment, retention strategies, possible proposals, NCCJ facilitation team, Mr. Robinson and Ms. Dyer.
Mayor Coleman, I think we might be going to Dr. Oliver next.
Oh, skipped over that. My apologies. Didn't mean to skip you, Dr. Oliver. It's not the way to treat company, is it? So with that, I'll yield the floor to you, sir.
Okay, thank you very much. It's great to be with you here. I know that your task force on racial equity is dealing with a number of different topics in criminal justice, but my focus here today is to talk about the hiring of law enforcement officers. And so Leslie will be putting up the slides and I'll take them sort of one at a time. And if you've got questions, please just stop and we can talk about the questions that you have. The first point is, hiring law enforcement officers is the most important function for a law enforcement agency. Great organizations hire well. Getting good people takes a lot of work and you have to be intentional about it. When you hire law enforcement officers, in most cases, you're hiring the vast majority of the future managers in an organization. And everyone likes to say that people are our most important resource. Nobody really denies that, but I don't think it's practiced by the vast majority of agencies in hiring well. Great organizations have great people. If you look at the top organizations, if you look at Southwest Airlines or Hewlett Packard or Google or IBM, they all hire very good people. And you need to hire excellent people. People evaluate the quality of the agency through the quality of the people that they're dealing with. So for a local community member, the officer that they deal with on the street provides the reputation for that law enforcement agency. So if that person treats that person with respect and dignity and handles their problem with care and compassion, as far as they're concerned, that's a great law enforcement agency. But if not, they feel like it's not a good law enforcement agency because of the way they were treated. So hiring is critical. The quality of the organization is reduced down to the quality of the people. No amount of training, no amount of equipment, no amount of resources will ever replace the quality of the individual officer. The talent searches are the first and most important battle for quality organizations. If you think about the great organizations of the world, one thing that they do better than other organizations they compete with is they hire the very best people from the same demographics as their competitors. I want to mention a study that comes out of Ohio State University. And the research question was, do Division I college football teams that have the top recruiting classes, does it show up in the most wins over losses? So the question was, do college football teams in Division I that have the top recruiting classes, does it show up in more wins over losses? And the answer was absolutely yes. You've got to get the top people to perform well on the field. In fact, in football, one of the sayings they have about this is that more important than the X's and O's, and some of you probably can finish this phrase, is the Jimmies and the Joes. And so you might be able to draw it up, but if you don't have talented people, they can't pull it off. And so you have to get top people. I'll go to slide 2. I think that top management has a key role in hiring. In fact, I would say if you're a chief executive officer and you're not involved in a hiring process because you're busy with other things, you probably really need to rethink that and get involved in a hiring process. because the most important decision a manager makes is who he or she hires, because that individual is the one who's going to provide the service that represents your organization. So you really have to get good people in the organization. You know, the individual that controls hiring controls the quality of the organization. So you do want to control the hiring process. I'll go back and use another sports metaphor again. If you think about in sports at the professional level, a lot of the head coaches want to be director of player personnel. They want to have influence on players that are drafting. Not all do, but a lot of them want to, because they believe whoever controls the talent really controls the output on the playing field. And so it really determines your level of effectiveness, and you've got to get the right people in the organization. If the people in your organization aren't competitive in the profession, then how can your organization be competitive in the profession? And so you've really got to get top people and search for them. And they're not easy to get. You also need to be thinking about developing your bench strength. You know, as you're hiring, who are going to be the future first line managers, who are going to be future middle line managers, who are going to be the future executives. Are you hiring people who have the ability to manage effectively and to lead? Are you looking at the qualities that are most important when you hire? What are those qualities? Do you know what they are? And so that becomes very important. And that is what I want to talk about next. So the 6 top qualities of effective law enforcement officers and the importance of emotional intelligence. In the last 20 years, conservatively, I've had the opportunity to speak to over 2,000 law enforcement managers and administrators and public officials that are involved in the hiring process. And I've talked about these 6 top qualities of effective law enforcement officers. And never once have I gotten a disagreement from anyone on any one of these 6 traits. Mind you that the people that I'm talking to are from state law enforcement agencies, city law enforcement agencies, villages, transit police agencies, campus police agencies, park police agencies, state agencies, local agencies, county agencies, national law enforcement agencies, but universally they agree these 6 traits are more important than anything else. And so they're all character based. The first one is high moral character. The law enforcement job is an integrity based job. The badge that the peace officer wears is a badge of integrity. And by the way, that's my favorite title for a law enforcement officer, is an American peace officer. That officer's word can be used to get a warrant, to make an arrest. That person is supposed to be the most trustworthy individual in our society. We tell young people, if you're in trouble, if you have a problem, look for a man or woman in blue, because in theory, that's a person you know you can trust. Anyone else out there, maybe you can trust them, maybe you can't trust them. But if a law enforcement officer does not have his or her integrity, they have nothing to sell to the public. And I'm sure all of you would agree with that. Number 2, and by the way, I'm giving you these actually in what I believe are their order of importance, is a service orientation. Service is what's primarily being sold in law enforcement. Whether you work at small town PD or big town PD, 80% of the calls for service are calls to do that, to serve and help people. Law enforcement is a helping profession. Service is what you sell. And so if you are not a service-oriented individual, law enforcement is not a good profession for you. And so that service mindset, making other people more important than yourself, is critical to doing well in the law enforcement profession. Trait number 3 is good human relations skills. Law enforcement officers meet and deal with people all day long. And oftentimes they have to go into a negative situation and attempt to leave people with something positive. You could only do that if you have good human relation skills. And so you're dealing with people at their worst. And so you may not be able to, when you're dealing with a law enforcement problem with a community member, give them their property back, heal their wounds, but you can be kind, you can listen well, you can be compassionate, you can be caring, you can be professional, and do those things that you can do. And if you've got great human relation skills, you leave people better than you found them. That's the acid test of every law enforcement intervention. In fact, law enforcement officers are familiar when they conduct traffic stops and actually issue someone a citation. If they've done it well, typically the last thing they hear is thank you. Now, people aren't thankful for getting cited, but they're thankful for the care, the compassion, the professionalism, the demeanor exhibited by the officer involved. And so that just makes a very big difference. Number 4 is team compatibility. Law enforcement agencies operate on the concept of team. We ask people to come in early, to stay late, be on call, to work evenings, to work nights, to work weekends, to work holidays. One can only do that if they're a team player, if the goal of the organization are more important than their personal goals. We certainly want them to have personal professional goals, but they have to be committed to the organization's vision, mission, core value, and major goals. That means they've got to be a team player. And if they're not a team player, if they don't want to do what needs to be done, when it needs to be done, to the best of their ability, then they're not compatible for law enforcement service. Number 5, being performance driven. Most law enforcement officers work independently, and they have to be an individual that seeks to be the very best that they can be. The only real competition you face in this life is not being as good as someone else, is being the best that you can be, doing your best and putting forth your best effort, having a good work ethic. When there's not a call for service, are you doing self-initiated activity? Are you serving people? Are you caring about people? Are you helping people? Are you working hard? Are you setting and achieving organizational goals? A law enforcement officer who is good at the job must be a performance-driven individual and pursue excellence in all they do. And number 6 is self-control. When things get out of control, does a law enforcement officer stay under control? Do they do what needs to be done, but do it professionally, with care and compassion? As a former 4-time police chief, at times I've had officers tell me, Chief, I treated that person the way they deserve to be treated. And my response to that is, that's the wrong answer. You treat people better than they deserve to be treated. You do your job. If they need to be arrested, they need to be cited, but you do it professionally, with care, and with compassion. You treat them the way you would want your mother treated, your father treated, your sister treated, your brother treated, your wife treated, your children treated, if they were the murderer, the rapist, and the robber. You do what you have to do, but you do it with care and compassion. If you think about, once again, all 6 of these traits, high moral character, service orientation, good human relation skills, a team compatible person, being performance driven, having self-control, they're all character based. You hire for character and you train for skills. This really deals with one's emotional intelligence. Emotional intelligence can be simply defined as the intelligent management of one's emotions. And so they are under control. It's people who know how to deal with others with care and compassion, listen well, and are conscious of how what they do impacts other people. I like to say that more important than how smart you are is how you are smart. We want people who are emotionally intelligent, who have the soft skills, which are the character-based skills. When you think about it, in law enforcement, in the vast majority of cases, when someone is receiving a verbal reprimand, a written reprimand, a suspension, a termination, or in the worst case scenario, they are indicted, it's because they have displayed poor character. Rarely are job actions taken against officers because of a lack of a technical ability. And when we hire, there tends to be an over focus on technical abilities and skills and an under focus on good character-based skills. And so that's where the focus needs to be. Now, I'm not saying that you don't want someone who doesn't have the mental horsepower. There are certainly some hard skills you do want. You do want people basically who have good writers. In fact, you should assess for one's writing ability before you hire them, because law enforcement is a writing intensive career field. You do want people who are good oral communicators. You do want people who are critical thinkers. So you do want people with certain skills, but the character-based skills have to be the most important. And when we send someone to a law enforcement academy to train them to be a police officer, they don't really need to know anything about law enforcement. We'll train them to do everything: how to shoot, how to make arrests, what the laws are, how to wear the uniform. We'll teach them everything they need to know. But teaching character should be done, is possible, but it's difficult. In fact, when you take an adult, and in most states across the country, you need to be 21 to be a peace officer. Some states allow it at 19, few states allow it at 18, but you're basically talking about an adult. And those character traits have been largely set at that point. And so you really need to focus on those traits and who you're hiring. So once again, talking to people from various law enforcement agencies, regardless of agency type, regardless of agency size, I've never had anybody say, not concerned about high moral character, don't want service orientation, good human relation skills aren't important, we don't want a compatible team member. They all would say that these traits are universal. That does not mean that they should not be validated by a job analysis before they're placed in your job description, and then identifying those traits, those abilities that are essential job functions. So we naturally look for the hard skills and sometimes dismiss the soft skills. And one of the things that I like to do in a hiring process is to use an entry-level assessment center to evaluate and measure and to assess these critical soft skills that cannot be seen in other parts of the process. So I'll go to next slide, number 4, the top 2 recruiting strategies. In law enforcement and basically outside of law enforcement, but particularly in law enforcement, there are 2 recruiting strategies that there's strong evidence that work better than anything else. The first one, the most effective one, is something called grow your own. That's when you identify people who have an interest in law enforcement at a young age before they're ever eligible to get hired in your law enforcement agency, and you bring them inside the agency in some formal way. It could be police explorers or some organization like that, where you get them in at 13, 14, 15, and 16, and you train them, coach them, mentor them, develop them, maybe even support them in their educational program, and you develop them. You get them in early before they get into problems in their life. You keep them out of trouble, and you develop them, and you create a separate pathway into your organization. This method is so effective that right now the FBI is also doing it. The FBI has an honors internship program that they use at colleges. You're probably aware that you can't graduate from a college university in America with a baccalaureate degree and walk into the FBI and become an agent. You have to do something else first. You have to have 3 to 5 years of work experience before you can get in. But they have an honors internship program where they get college students. They have a rigorous selection process. They select them, and then 2 or 3 years while they're still in college, they're working in the local field office with agents after they've been background and screened on a squad, and helping them in a support role in their work. When they graduate, they get hired by the FBI in a full-time support position. And after they're there 3 to 5 years, they update their background and they go to new agent school. And one of the reasons they're doing this is because they're trying to attract minorities. So growing your own works better than anything else. The best example I've ever seen of this is probably 12 years ago. I was invited to speak at a recruitment selection and retention conference in Kansas City, Kansas. And there are agencies there from around the country. Most of them are in the region in the Midwest. And when the Kansas City, Kansas Police Department spoke, they indicated that they had a 17-person command staff, and the chief and all their command level officers. 14 of the 17 command level officers had gotten hired by the agency in a cadet program. In other words, they grew all their top talent and they all rose right to the top. The best example I've ever seen of it is growing your own. This is a long time, intentional, hardworking commitment that you make in growing your own, going into the community, identifying people who have an interest, bringing them in, pouring into them, and developing them. In fact, probably all of you that are listening to this presentation are successful in what you do. And without any fear of error, I suspect all of you would say that you had a mentor or multiple mentors. You got to where you are because people poured into you and developed you. And that's really what you're doing. You're doing a mentoring program. And the mentoring process is very powerful. The master apprentice method is the best training method in the world and the oldest and still probably the best. You basically develop your talent. Going on to number 2, targeted selection. Targeted selection is identifying who would be successful in the job and then determining where I can find that type of individual. This is what executive search firms do. If an executive search firm is hired to find a CEO of a corporation or a nonprofit or a government agency, they sit down with the hiring authority and they say, tell me what is the knowledge, skills, abilities, education, training, experience, and behaviors and traits that would make one effective in this job. Once they develop this profile, then they go out and find matches to that profile. So they're intentional and they know where to go and find that person and bring that person to the organization. The top people and the best people in most cases do not initiate their application. They are found, they are sought out for the position. And so targeted selection is where you know the target you're trying to hit, you know what it looks like. And what I find, having put on seminars around the country on recruitment, selection, and retention, that most agencies have really not taken the time to identify who succeeds in this job. What are the critical success factors? What are the knowledge, skills, abilities, education, training, experience, behaviors, and traits that we are looking for in someone who succeeds in the job? And any agency really can do that because you can run this process of reverse engineering by identifying the best police officers in your agency and then say, what are the things they have in common? What are those commonalities? Now you have a profile of what to look for. In fact, targeted selection has some personal meaning to me because I'm going to tell you how I got into law enforcement. Now, I'm a blue blood. I'm a second generation law enforcement officer. And I went to the University of Cincinnati and I was a criminal justice major. So I had a heart for law enforcement. But while I was at the University of Cincinnati, one of my professors, who was a former Dayton police officer, who's kind of a mentor to me, had a close friend who was a sergeant on the Ohio State Highway Patrol. And this sergeant came to Professor Haley and said, we're looking for minority police officers, minority troopers, candidates in Ohio State Highway Patrol. And he gave him a profile of what it was he was looking for this type of person. Who do you have in your academic program that matches that profile? Keith Haley told him, I got 2 guys. And so we were both in one of his classes. At the end of class one day, he approached us both. He said he had a sergeant recruiter in the Ohio State Highway Patrol that was looking for minority candidates. They have a big minority recruitment drive. Would you be interested in meeting with him? We both said yes, set up a meeting a couple of weeks later. This guy came to his office, talked to us for about an hour and a half, talked to us about the Ohio State Highway Patrol, asked us a little bit about ourselves. We filled out these pre-application cards. We later went to Columbus, the state capital, to take the test. And both of us went through the entire process and got offered positions with the Ohio State Highway Patrol. Now, the other student, Chuck, didn't take it. He eventually became a Cincinnati police officer. But here's my point. This sergeant recruiter did not come to the University of Cincinnati Student Union, set up a booth, brochures, big poster board, and try to get people walking by to be interested in Ohio State Highway Patrol. He did a process of targeted selection. Hey, I know who would be good in this job, and let me go to people who have access to a pool of candidates and say who matches this profile, and then be intentional about recruiting them. That process is both effective and it's efficient. And so targeted selection works very well. I'm going to go to the next slide. Key philosophies in hiring for diversity. Most law enforcement agencies across America would say they're trying to diversify their pool and trying to figure out how to do it. Well, you need to be intentional about diversity. And oftentimes, when they recruit for minorities, they're kind of fishing from the same ponds. They don't have relationships with, the minority community. So give you an example of that. I had an interview a couple of years ago with a local station here in the Dayton, Ohio area, and they were asking me about a lot of the suburban communities here and why they didn't have as many minorities as maybe the city of Dayton does, but Dayton still needs more minorities. But why they had almost none, and Dayton, has a pool of them. And so one of the things that I said is that, it's the holiday season. And if I were to come to your house during the holiday season for a holiday party, the people who would be there would be the people you're in relationship with. And if I didn't see a diverse group of people at your house, that tells me you're not in relationship with those people. And so it's hard to recruit people that you're not in relationship with. You've got to be involved in those segments of the minority community that you are trying to recruit. And this is done from the top down. The chief, the CEO, the sheriff has to drive this process. They have to basically set some goals. They have to hold managers accountable. They have to ensure that every manager is going to be a recruiter. They have to develop long-term relationships. I'll emphasize the word long-term relationships with the minority community to develop a pool of candidates who come in that organization. And so it needs to be that. CALEA has a standard on diversity matching the service community. That's been a long-term standard. I'm a former CALEA commissioner, and so that standard's been around for 20 years, that the population of the law enforcement agency of officers should match its service community. When you do that, you're certainly going to have a lot more credibility by that community. You're certainly going to make more effective decisions in that community as an agency. And so there's a number of things that benefit from that. One of the 2 articles that you received from Leslie was one that I wrote for International Association of Chiefs of Police online magazine, and it talks about the benefit of human diversity. So you might want to go through that and look at that, because it just talks about the benefits of diversity. Diversity must be an organizational philosophy. It can't be a program with a beginning and an ending, but it must be a philosophy. And if it's a philosophy, it must start with the CEO of that law enforcement agency. You know, it must be driven top down. As the chief, people need to hear from you. They need to know it's important to you. They need to know they're going to be held accountable by you, and it's something that you need to be out front and leading the way on. You must be intentional, because if there's a lack of diversity, then what you can probably assume that implicit bias or hidden bias has been at work and has kept your agency from hiring the diversity of people that you could hire. It's, how do I want to say this? If your agency is not as diverse as your service population, you have to ask, why is that the case, and start to do some examination. You know, maybe there's some gatekeepers in your organization who are blocking your goals to be a diverse organization. So I'll say it that way. I think you need to set and achieve diversity goals. And in achieving and setting these diversity goals, it is not hiring people that are unsuitable for the job. That's never, ever been a good approach to achieving diversity. When you achieve diversity or affirmative action, it's a recognition that there's a diverse pool of candidates who qualify for the position, and that you have to be intentional to go out and find them and to get them. But you really need to set and achieve goals. And if anything is important to you, you will set and achieve those goals. Then you have to have some policy and management controls over what you want to do, whether it's being done or not. You know, so you've got some goals and you have some objectives that lead to the goal, and then periodically you're measuring how well you're doing on those goals and making sure that there's proper training, that there's leadership, that there's accountability, and there's an understanding of where you're going and why, so that you have a vision. Okay, then I'll go to the last area here: how to assist small and other local law enforcement agencies in hiring. Your state is trying to do that. Our state is trying to do in the state of Ohio. In fact, the governor of Ohio, Governor Mike DeWine, has created an Officer of Law Enforcement Recruitment with a focus on getting more minorities and women in the law enforcement. He has brought me in as the lead consultant on that effort. And so we are now trying to build our effort in that area. And some of the things that we are doing that I'm recommending here is provide information on how to hire well. Law enforcement agencies need to understand how to hire well. What does a good process look like? A good process needs to be really very comprehensive. You need to have things like a written exam, a polygraph, a personal history questionnaire, a background, a psych, a medical, physical agilities test. Those are things that you should have in a hiring process. In fact, there are 3 components that every law enforcement agency must have. You must have a personal history questionnaire, because that precedes the background investigation. It's that document that the background investigators are using to go through the background of the individual. You must have a psychological examination, because you need to determine whether people are psychologically suited or not. And you must have a medical examination. You need to make sure that people are medically suitable to endure the rigors of the law enforcement profession. So there are more small agencies, as you know, larger agencies. And so agencies need to know how to hire well and how to manage that process. Create a website with links to other websites that provides information to law enforcement agencies about hiring. Many of you might be familiar with IACP's website for hiring. It's called Discover Policing. If you've never been on that website, you want to look at that website, discoverpolicing.org. It is funded by a grant from BJA, and they assist law enforcement agencies with hiring. In fact, any law enforcement agency in America can put their job openings on that site. That is a site to educate the general public about the law enforcement job, what it requires, how to prepare yourself, what happens in the basic academy. They really try to answer a lot of good questions. Might be something you want to replicate in the state of North Carolina, and also have a link to that site. Develop recruitment fairs. Maybe you want to help law enforcement agencies find quality candidates by putting together a process where you pre-screen and identify viable candidates for law enforcement agencies, maybe even some coaching, mentoring, or training, and then you bring them to a certain location and invite law enforcement agencies to meet and talk with those people to look at them as potential candidates. Next is developing and sharing model policies and procedures. You might develop a model policy on a good, solid personal history questionnaire. If that document is probably, less than 20, 25 pages, is probably not that good. A good, solid background investigation process. A background investigation, once again, is something that every law enforcement agency must have because it's a character-based job. In fact, the purpose of the background investigation is to evaluate someone's suitability for the job based on character. And so what does that look like? The psychological examination process, and sort of, that should be two parts. That should be an interview, ideally with a police psychologist, and then they should use some instrument, that testing instrument, where they assess the psychological fitness of it. They should know what are those critical success factors that make someone effective in the job, and then be evaluating that candidate based on the information that you provide. So there's lots of different policies and procedures when it comes to recruitment, selection, and retention that you want to provide to agencies so that they can adapt them and then use them to be more effective in hiring. Provide training on hiring, how to do it well. And agencies really don't understand how to do it well. For instance, I am a believer that if you have a hiring process, your hiring process should start and conclude in no longer than 120 days. I will tell you, as a director of a criminal justice program, where the majority of my students aspire to be in law enforcement, that the vast majority of hiring process that my students are familiar with don't start and finish in 120 days. They go on for 6 months, 8 months, 9 months, 1 year. And it's like when people start into the process, they go into the tunnel and they don't know when they're coming out. And that really does not speak well of law enforcement agencies, because if people, especially good people, your most important resource, then you effectively manage that process. And so providing training on how to do that well is very important. I'm going to mention two other things that aren't on this slide, but one of them is decertification. I don't know if you're doing decertification. I suspect you are in the state of North Carolina, but we have too many officers that have problems in one agency and then end up in another agency. And so that needs to be avoided. That's the Tamir Rice story. My old agency, Cleveland PD, the officer was involved in that incident, came off a suburban law enforcement agency where they basically documented that, in their opinion, he was not suitable for law enforcement work, and yet he ends up at the Cleveland Police Department. So you need to have a very rigorous, robust decertification process. And so one of the things that we're talking about doing, certainly Governor Ohio wants to do, is strengthen ours, because really it's not very strong at all. And so you want to be able to take someone's peace officer certification if they've demonstrated that they're not suitable, not fit for law enforcement service. And then last, you want to promote accreditation, whether it's state accreditation or international accreditation through CALIA. I'm a huge believer, and I mentioned my bias that I was a former 9-year CALIA commissioner, but I think that when agencies are accredited, you know they're doing those things are in the best interest of their community and in the best interest of their staff. If they're not accredited, they might be doing them and they might not be doing them. Okay, I've gone on for a while. Let me stop and take questions.
Adam?
Chief Davis.
My question, Dr. Oliver, has to do with decertification. Are you guided by a policy in the police department as it relates to decertification, or is that just a practice that the agency has adopted, or is that through an accreditation sort of policy or recommendation that's already drafted up, what that looks like?
Okay. Every state in the United States have what's called a POST. POST is an acronym for Peace Officer Standards and Training Board. And so you're certified as a peace officer in the state. Therefore, you're decertified as a peace officer through the state. And so the decertification process in Ohio is through the Ohio Peace Officers Training Commission. And so that's really where that should be housed in every state, that you take away someone's license as a peace officer. And then additionally, one of the things that's being discussed on a national basis is to have a national database of decertified peace officers.
And I think we have that in place here in the state of North Carolina. I was just wondering, is that process sort of an automatic sort of flow into the state's decertification process as a result of some disciplinary action or some internal affairs, kind of investigation, that it automatically goes to the state for decertification?
There are rules that are promulgated that indicated under what circumstances and situation that one might be decertified. And so when that happens, then it triggers the process being initiated by the local agency to the state to have them review that officer to determine whether they should be decertified or not.
Okay.
And that happens on a board level where they vote to decertify an officer.
So Leslie, I guess I can point to you, since I'm still relatively new to the state of North Carolina's process, and you're certainly adept to it. Is that process one that sort of stumbles across the commission only as a result of somebody, making an appeal to us, or are there some automatic triggers that present a case before us for decertification?
So Chief, to kind of break it down, the wandering officer problem, as we have talked about it, making sure that one officer doesn't leave under a cloud of suspicion and go somewhere else, that their certification is checked. It's always if they're switching commissions. So if someone leaves the police department and goes to a sheriff's office, they will always be background checked. That will always go through the new commission for certification with the new commission. So if you're switching types of law enforcement, it will always get checked through our commissions. The issue, though, is if you're going from one sheriff's office to another or one PD to another, then it's not always captured. It would depend on what was written on the affidavit of separation, right, and whether or not, when that was sent to CJ, that would be something that they would then initiate, or sheriffs, that they would then initiate an investigation. So that is sometimes where that kind of gap appears.
Right.
And I can tell you, people have talked about whether or not to, whenever someone leaves an agency, examine certifications at that point in time. That would probably almost triple the work for staff. So we would have to have huge increased budgets and staff at both of our commissions in order to be able to accommodate that kind of transfer. So it's an imperfect, it's a sieve, I guess. There are holes in the bucket.
I got you. Thank you.
I do want to point out that there is a national list of decertified officers maintained by IDLIST, which is the International Association of Directors in Law Enforcement Standards and Training. You can go through our state, you can go through the process of signing up to be able to have access to that. There were discussions at one of our last meetings with the sheriff's working group we have put together about in expanding on that within our state. We report, our state training and standards report to that group as well. And I think that there is a push now for some federal funding to support that effort, because it's been very difficult for them to promote that and expand on it at that level because of that International Association of Directors of Law Enforcement Training and Standards. They have limited funding, and they've been looking for a source to be able to fund that and maintain that adequately to report. So I did want to point that out.
And Sheriff Ingram, to that point, CJ Commission just voted last Friday at our most recent meeting to have our standards divisions, both sheriff standards and CJ standards within the Department of Justice, create a website on DOJ's website where you can plug in an officer's name and search, and it will tell you whether or not they are decertified, because that information is a public record, but we didn't want to put a list of people. And so it'll be a search engine basically for anyone in North Carolina who has been decertified that DOJ will maintain.
Yes, and in our discussion, representatives from both training and standards divisions on CJ and sheriff's side were there and mentioned putting that in place. And I proposed the idea at the time of creating a link from that page to go to Idlist and be able to access the national database that they can build upon, because we have in our area, we do have a number of people that are applying to come to work with our agency that are outside of our state, coming from outside of our state.
Let me make another important point. One of the reasons that you guys have all been formed as a task force, it's really in response to national incidents of police misconduct. Whenever you have an actual national incident of police misconduct, in fact, I've been asked about this on several interviews by reporters. When you saw that George Floyd incident, what was the first thing you thought of? My answer is always the same. My answer is, I wonder what the background of that individual is. And in almost every incident of police misconduct, usually it was a case of one, negligent hire. The agency knew or should have known that this person was not suitable for police work and should have never hired him in the first place. Or it's a situation of negligent retention. The person had a series of law enforcement problems, demonstrated dysfunctionality, was not suitable for the position, and it was never addressed. So you can take almost every case and look at the officers involved. It was either negligent hire or negligent retention. In fact, quite honestly, the reason I started studying and researching police hiring is because, hold on, something's going on my computer here. Is because I became frustrated looking around the state of Ohio and around the country and seeing problem officers, seeing officers doing things. And I thought, how did this officer ever get hired? For instance, I want to go into the case. I'm working with a law firm on a case right now involving an officer who actually raped a person while on duty. Now you have to ask, I mean, this officer is now in prison. You have to ask, how does a person like that get hired? What went wrong? Law enforcement hires their problems. In fact, when I conducted some extensive research on this about 20 years ago, an Ohio research study on hiring, I really asked this question: do we hire bad officers or do we make bad officers? In reality, in law enforcement, we do both. But most of the problems, we hire them. Because
thank you, Dr.
they learn
Oliver.
that before coming an adult.
Thank you, Dr. Oliver. I wonder if you can stick around for a bit. We wanted to make sure that we allocated enough time for discussion session. I know we need to have Ms. Dismukes give us some information on some requested research information we asked. So it'd be very helpful if you could stick around if you have time to do it. And also task force members, I know we had targeted, usually our meetings to end at around 90 minutes in. It looks like we may run over a bit today, so I wanted to make sure that we were able to spend time on our discussion and some of the ideas and the recommendations. So if Dr. Oliver would have time to stay with us, that'd be great. And we may, I told Ms. Dismukes I have a hard stop at probably 11:50 for a 12 o'clock obligation. So we'll keep doing it, but I'll turn it over to you, Ms. Leslie, and then we'll move into the discussion. But Doctor, if you can stick around, we would appreciate it.
Thank you, Mayor Colvin. All right, I'll try to do this as quickly as possible so that you can get to the discussion portion. This is meant to tee up the discussion for today so that we can hopefully come to some concrete, recommendations. So these are potential recommendations for discussion based upon the research you asked me to do at the last meeting surrounding recruitment and retention. So one of the things we discussed is whether or not we want to have a recruitment and retention best practices document that comes out of this, something that says that for the state of North Carolina, here is what we prioritize. What types of ideas would we want to go in that document? Would we want to concentrate on emotional IQ, that kind of thing? A lot of the principles that Dr. Oliver's talked about this morning, do you want to consider some of those thoughts for a recruitment and retention best practices document? I will say briefly, we don't have to have the best practices document by December 1. We have the second 6 months of the task force for our implementation phase, because I know we have a lot of really short time and we want to make sure we get the best practices document right. So I think we could fashion a recommendation that we want to have this best practices document that is unique to North Carolina and focuses on the challenges we face in North Carolina. So that's one thing for y'all to discuss. Another is whether we want to consider a recommendation of different state models that they had. You know, when Dr. Oliver told me that the Ohio Office of Law Enforcement Recruitment was created within their Department of Public Safety, and he's going to head that up. That's an interesting idea. Do we want to consider something like that for North Carolina? Also, adding criteria to minimum qualifications. We basically had talked about adding criteria to the minimum qualifications or revising criteria for minimum qualifications to address the barriers to entry. And so I gave you the code provisions that we would look at for both CJ and sheriffs. And I can pull these up as y'all discuss. We don't have to look at them right now. They are comprehensive. But 09B0101 and 09B0111 are really where those minimum requirements live for police officers. And then how do we capture emotional intelligence? I think you'll see in there that it's not really captured. Then also, so, you know, one idea is raising the bar to entry. We want to have good people. How do we get good people that have the qualities we want? And then the other question for this group is how do we revise the criteria to make sure we don't have barriers to entry? Looking at the Class B misdemeanor manual, are there other things there? If you look at 09B0101 sub 3D, it talks about drug testing. Would we want to be more specific to also recommend statements about past drug use? Chief Davis, this was something you talked a little bit about last time. You know, if you smoked some marijuana as a teenager, do we want that to be a barrier to your entry into this profession now when you're an adult? That's something that could be a more affirmative statement if you wanted to consider that. Thinking about some of the cases that have come before us at CJ Standards at the commission, sometimes officers feel like they can't put that information on their personal history statement. Then the problem becomes they left it off their personal history statement because they were afraid they wouldn't get hired. And now we have a material misrepresentation issue. We have an issue where they have not told the truth because they were afraid they couldn't get hired. And then it becomes a commission issue and affects their certification. So how could we be more intentional about that? Then also, as Sheriff Ingram pointed out in his remarks, consistency between CJ and Sheriff's codes. For example, psych evals are required right now in the CJ code, but not in the Sheriff's code. And if we wanted to consider making those recurring, that's something that is not in the code that we could look at putting in the code. And granted, we can't put it in the code. We would make a recommendation to each commission to make the changes within their commission. And so that would be the nature of our recommendation coming out of this work group. Also, what about probation and parole? You know, we're talking about officers who interact with the public. Probation and parole certainly do that. and they are governed under the corrections rules, and there are largely separate definitions of, for example, what misdemeanor convictions disqualify candidates. So do we want to consider that as part of our recommendations? Also, do we want to consider expanding the CJ Fellows program? Currently, the CJ Fellows program and the documents that I sent you kind of lay this out, but essentially it allows someone to have their education paid for if they will commit to doing a certain amount of time as a law enforcement officer. I believe it's 4 years. And so that opportunity exists. But it was only limited to certain counties. The barrier was 75,000 people, and the county had to be a population of below 75,000 for someone who lives in that county to apply. This last session, the legislature just raised it to 125,000, and that should be tier 1, not tier exclamation point, which includes now Pitt and Cumberland, but we still have about 20 other counties that are not eligible. We would need to request legislation to make the other 20 eligible for that, but we would also need to request budget support for the tuition, but also for the program administrative needs. So whether that's something that this group wants to consider, that can be part of the discussion. And those are the things that I have teed up for y'all's discussion today, and basically trying to move us to a place where we can make some decision points. And I think that Michael and Karen are going to navigate the next portion. But I wanted to put those ideas out there. If there are any points in time where you want to see portions of the code, I've got all of that ready and can screen share. But I do think, again, if you guys decide certain recommendations and changes need to be made, I can go back and make those in a more concrete manner and send them out ahead of time for our discussions as well. So I think it's really now at this juncture, what does this group want to recommend with respect to recruitment and retention?
Thank you, Leslie. Can everyone hear me? I'm on my phone audio. I just want to make sure we're okay. So thank you also to Dr. Oliver for your presentation. I think it aligns well with conversations that we had in the first meeting. And thank you, Leslie, for synthesizing that data and providing the comprehensive information to support the recommendation that folks might want to make around retention and recruitment. So I wanted to start off by asking you all, whether some of the questions that were posed to Dr. Oliver were around decreditization. I wanted to know if there are any other questions from the presentation, the earlier parts of the presentation that you had around the material that he presented you all.
Actually, I guess I can speak. Thank you, Dr. Oliver, for your great presentation. I think some of the themes that resonated for me were the quality of applicant that, agencies are looking for, as opposed to just, thinking in terms of numbers, ensuring that our focus is identifying the most qualified people for the position. And sometimes I think it's a miss when we look at the person that runs the fastest, the one that has the military experience. They're great applicants, but there's so many other individuals that, have those very key and core qualities that can make a good police officer. But traditionally, our work has been centered around, the physical sometimes. We're a paramilitary type of organization, and I think it's only been in recent years that we've started looking at EI, what emotional intelligence looks like for police departments, when most of the trouble that comes our way, as you said, Dr. Oliver, is because we have applicants that possibly did not navigate a situation with good judgment. The issue is, and I think it's not just for me, but for a lot of police chiefs, is how do you identify those qualities sometimes in applicants in the hiring process, when sometimes it takes a much deeper dive into who an applicant is before you can really sort of unearth those types of qualities. Mostly everything is on a piece of paper, and applicants respond to questions based on what they think the department wants to hear. And then you find out later on that that's not exactly who this person is. So I think it's just kind of important that maybe we look more at what emotional intelligence looks like, and how do you, make those kind of assessments on the front end?
Well, Chief Davis, you mentioned emotional intelligence, and the two domains of emotional intelligence are social awareness and relationship management. And those traits that I talk about really fit into both of those categories. So it is very important. That background investigation process is critical. In addition, being complemented by the personal history questionnaire. That's a document that they fill out. Some agencies call it the confidential questionnaire. That's many pages that goes over their entire background. All the places they went to school, everywhere they've lived, any crashes they've been involved in, just on and on. So it gives a very thorough and complete overview of that person's background. And that's what the background investigator or investigators work through to evaluate the suitability of the candidate.
I have a question along those lines, and simply because I'm not familiar with law enforcement, but is there a standard application or process that your accreditation agencies give, or is it kind of based on the department's process individually?
I mean, as far as the background investigation process and the personal history questionnaire, those are developed by the local agency. Accreditation standards basically address the fact that you should be doing them, and maybe certain things you need to review in them, but they're not that specific. They tell you what you need to do, and it's really up to the agency as to how they're going to do it. And so that's pretty much how accreditation works.
And Mayor Coleman, I can tell you, our commissions have a personal history statement, each of them, that is required and pretty comprehensive. It's 30, maybe plus pages that anyone who's applying for BLET has to fill out.
And on that note, it's important that when an officer applies to another agency and they are required to fill out another F3, the one gap we have now is on the CJ side. There is a loophole where they're not necessarily required to go back through the entire process. And CJ is looking at correcting that. On the sheriff's side, you are required to go back through the entire process each time, filling out that form completely and going through all of that process. And they compare those forms as well to ensure that there were no omissions on the initial form or on the current form. And a lot of times there are issues brought before the standards commissions on those very topics, like someone mentioned earlier, where an applicant may not disclose marijuana use for fear of not being hired years ago, whereas it's more commonplace for people to disclose it now, and has been accepted. So they would disclose it on a later application, and those discrepancies would be brought before the commission for review.
So a couple of things I'm hearing, questions around standardization for application, right? We have application process for police departments is sort of based on what the police department wants to see in their officers, based on the community, things like that. Dr. Oliver spoke to also the importance of the gatekeeper, the people who are doing those interviews. In the documents that Leslie provided, there seemed to be a heavy emphasis on the technical aspect of things, the practices, the policies and things like that. But there's also, who actually interview the people for their demeanor, their attitude, that sort of thing. Speaking to Chief Davis's point around, the quality of the officer being important, but who actually does that? Who does that assessment of the quality of the officer? So I'm wondering, if that is something that you all think is important, thinking about how do we add the emotional intelligence or the quality of the officer aspect to the recruitment process. Where does that need to be implemented, and how do we get to the people who are actually interviewing and making those assessments to be able to better choose officers, or to use that emotional intelligence marker as an indication for employment?
And I would say the first place you have to start is with a job task analysis. when you do a job task analysis, you look at those job tasks that must be done by someone who's a law enforcement officer, and then you rate those job tasks by importance and frequency. And when you get through that process, then you ultimately identify job tasks that are essential job functions. Essential job functions is consistent with, ADA, Americans with Disability Act, because you can deny someone a job if they can't perform an essential job function with or without reasonable accommodations. So you really want to be very clear on, once again, what are the knowledge, skills, abilities, education, training, experience, behaviors, and traits that make one suitable for the job. You develop what I would emphasize as a flexible profile, and then you hire to that profile. But you have to first know what you're looking for. If you don't know what you're looking for, you can't hit the target.
Dr. Oliver, you said something that I think was really important that probably doesn't exist in too many agencies, and that is training for recruiters, training for background investigators, because all too often, I think, we pass on these responsibilities to our officers, and it's their responsibility to check off the boxes that this person met this requirement and met that requirement. But how do we ensure that even quality customer service is baked into that process, and that we're not turning off applicants? Because sometimes, police, we can have sort of a mirror kind of syndrome about, if you don't look like me, talk like me, or act like me, you don't get to be a part of the club. And I'm only saying that because I spent a lot of time in recruitment throughout my career, recruitment and hiring. And it took, conditioning officers to realize that you were sitting in that chair one day and somebody gave you a chance, and you were flawed and you had issues and you weren't perfect. And as long as a person meets the requirements, they don't have to look like you or talk like you or be from where you're from. But I think some of that comes from conditioning our officers to understand what we expect in these processes, as opposed to it just being check the box off and this person gets to go through that whole gatekeeper sort of conversation. What does training look like for the gatekeepers?
Well, you said that very well. I think you should need to identify and train recruiters. They are some of the most important people in your organization. There needs to be specific training for a recruiter, and you need to have people who do it. And in a mid or large size agency, you probably should have full-time year-round recruiters.
Yep.
So it sounds like what I hear you guys saying is that we do want to look at best practices in recruitment and retention, and the things that might be important for that are prioritizing. I don't think we can mandate a state job task analysis with KSAs, but what we can do is say, we think each agency should do that. So I'll draft that for your review for the next meeting, including seeking emotional intelligence characteristics, how we do that, what those characteristics are based on what Dr. Oliver said to us, and also who is doing the hiring, training those people, perhaps having some folks year round, putting that also into part of the best practices. Are there other things that should go as part of that recruitment and retention best practices that you all want to highlight or focus on?
What was the final outcome about the tracking of the decertification? I remember we talked about it a little bit, but when there's an issue with an officer, what was the resolution to that?
So the decertification of any officer is a public record in North Carolina, and it will be available on the DOJ website as soon as our IT folks can get, now that the commission's voted to do that, as soon as our IT folks can get that done. And for Sheriff Ingram's comment, I've got a note to myself to make sure they're linking it to our ad list. So that is available. But if you're talking about other issues like Giglio and that kind of thing, that's a longer term, more complicated question. But the decertification is public record and will be available.
Okay. Dr. Oliver also made a point around having the end in mind, as far as, I think in your opening statements, you said that many of the people that we recruit end up becoming the managers in departments, and perhaps taking a look at that process too. Is what is what is the criteria for becoming a manager? You know, the upper mobility within the force, those sorts of things. I want to have a clarifying question for Leslie. There's a meeting. Is there a meeting before our task force meeting next Friday with the working group to work through some of the recommendations? Because if not, I want to have us think about based on what we. Okay, just making sure.
We need to nail it down. Yeah, we need to nail it down in this meeting. And then what I'll do is put together a document that sends out to everyone, and everyone can then comment on that document as to whether that encompasses what the group wants to recommend. Okay,
perfect. So let's based on what we've heard today and based on what we've had shared, what are some other things that we would like to perhaps recommend around retention and recruitment for the task force to look at for next week?
I can go back to the slides if it would help also, just let me know.
Yeah, I'd like to add, and I don't know if this is a possibility for our training commission to potentially look at what orientation or some type of fundamental training for recruiters and background investigators. Is that something that we could look at providing as, you know, some type of consistent process and, you know, a better understanding of individuals that are in those roles of you know, what success looks like as it relates to when we're looking to hire diversity, when we're looking to hire, you know, people who have great moral character, and what's appropriate questions, what's inappropriate. I think it would be great to have some type of, even if it's a couple of hours, even if it's a virtual training for recruiters and background investigators.
Chief, I would like to speak to that. I think that would be better served through our Justice Academy.
Mm-hmm.
They could develop a program and be able to do some type of certification process. And that way, you know, that would fall under, as far as being recognized by both commissions, but our Justice Academy could do a very good job at developing one, and maybe even some type of in-service annual training for our recruiters, because that's extremely important. The thing that concerns me about the recruitment part of it is not so much the agencies that have the full-time recruiters, as Dr. Oliver had mentioned, but these smaller agencies that we have, and there are so many of them in our state that maybe have 20 people or less in the agency, and the person that's doing the recruitment is doing that double duty. It may be an investigator that's working a caseload, or a combination of people with no one really focusing on that, or, you know, just giving it enough time to, as was mentioned, check the blocks, which concerns me. And then to how do we cross that hurdle as a state to ensure that even those agencies are performing at the level with regards to recruitment, as Dr. Oliver mentioned.
Good points. Thank you, Sheriff. And I do think that, you know, your suggestion is, as it relates to the Justice Academy, that would be a great spot to potentially launch, you know, some type of training. And you're right, here in North Carolina, we have so many agencies that are small agencies. One day is Officer Jones that's checking the boxes or making it happen. And then the next day it could be potentially somebody else that's processing an application. Yeah.
If I can ask a clarifying question on that recommendation so I know how to write it up. It sounds like I'm hearing you say there are two potential areas we could look at. One is, as Sheriff Ingram mentioned earlier, we know a lot of our agencies are CALEA accredited, but then some of our smaller agencies can't afford it. And so both sheriffs and CJ are looking at a North Carolina accreditation so that we can ensure that they've got that accreditation. So do we want to include this idea in the potential accreditation for the North Carolina accreditation that both commissions are considering? Do we want to recommend that, in addition to recommending a training course at the Justice Academy for in-service training for people who are doing the recruiting? for the agencies? And also a further question is, do you want to recommend a change to the administrative code that requires an agency to have a person trained in recruiting? Those are just questions. I want to make sure I know your thoughts so that I can draft up your recommendations for you to consider.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead, Sheriff.
I certainly think we need to make some recommendations with regards to the training, the being uniform with regards to our commissions. Excuse me just a minute. Go ahead, Chief. I have to look at something on my desk real quick.
Oh, okay. Well, I think it would be great if we could package it in a way that people or agencies see that this is a new opportunity, for them, that's sort of provided in a way that, because everybody has to go through a recruiting process, no matter how big or small it is. So I really believe that if it's sort of a standalone course that sheriffs and chiefs can say, okay, you're the recruiter for the day, and I want you to go through this training because this is something that will help to ensure that we're following some of the best practices as it relates to hiring and recruiting. How that falls into the accreditation process, maybe it could be both, that you have the class, but at the same time it's part of the state accreditation that a great organization, a great North Carolina police agency or law enforcement agency has this component included also in their accreditation.
I agree, Chief. And with the accreditation process, one thing that was mentioned going through the process with our agency, I mentioned this the other day. The one thing that we took away from that more so than anything else was early warning system. And Chief, I know you're familiar with it, Dr. Oliver, and that is one of the best things we've implemented in our agency since I've been sheriff. And I'm very proud of that system because it allows you to identify potential problems early on and get on top of that. And we all know that we are dealing with human beings. They have ups and downs, good days and bad days, just like any other human being. But being able to identify those, especially as it relates to use of force, is critical. This state accreditation would also potentially incorporate something like the early warning system, which I think is key in the retention side of this discussion here. So I believe that we should promote that as much as possible or encourage that. I do think that they're ready to kick off the program with the state. The only issue they have right now is funding. It was in the budget proposed this past year, and there's some discussions with regards to seeking other sources to get that funding off the ground, because they have to have a person to be able to administer the program and the technology to be able to create a database and support that. So a lot of it, though, would be supported, as with accredited agencies. You have assessors come in from other agencies around the country to conduct an assessment. Agencies within North Carolina would voluntarily have people on this or working with this program to serve as assessors, and that would reduce those costs. But the cost associated with the state program is minimum. I mean, it's extremely affordable for any size agency, and that was intentional, so we could encourage as many agencies as possible to be a part of that. And I think that that is critical moving forward.
Any other thoughts as far as potential recommendations for retention and recruitment? A lot of great ideas shared so far. Thank you so much.
How does the committee feel about consistency, recommending that there be consistency between the CJ and sheriff's codes? You know, right now they're two different commissions and they each vote separately. They each amend their rules separately. And for the most part, they are consistent and they check in with each other and that kind of thing, as we all know who are sitting on the commissions. But do we feel like it's an important enough priority for us to recommend consistency there, or what do folks think?
Sitting on the commission or one of the commissions, I would be the first to encourage some better consistency between the two. I mean, even with the forms that are used, as I mentioned earlier, with regards to psychological evaluations being required by both, you know, there is an associated cost, and that's something that we take in consideration on both commissions as well. When you implement something like this, it is a considerable cost to the local governing body. But in my humble opinion, I think it's a minimal cost compared to what the potential is on the back end if you get it wrong. And I think that we need to encourage more communication and more consistency with both commissions as it relates to that. Now, you know, in fairness, one would question, well, why do we have two? Why don't we have one commission? But the function of the sheriffs, as compared to a police department, in some respects is very different. We have to handle court proceedings, we handle the detention centers and civil process, things of that nature. That is different. We also, on the sheriff's side, handle all of the telecommunicators certifications as well as the detention officer certification. So it involves more than or a different area than the CJ Commission, both equally important. So I think if we can work towards consistency and with those commissions and encourage things like this, this program we're talking about, this accreditation program that would be run by the CJ Commission but supported by the Sheriff's Commission, just benefits our law enforcement community overall moving forward.
I wanted to ask real quick, Leslie, could you share your screen one more time? Because I wanted to ask folks if they wanted to, you mentioned parole and probation, and I wanted to know if we had what we needed to say, that perhaps it is something we wanted to add to this recommendation for next week, or is it something that we might need to have some more conversation about, more airtime about, before we can perhaps include that as a part of the recommendation? So we want to make sure they didn't get missed in the conversations.
So I think this was the slide. So probation and parole are currently under the corrections rules, but they have contact with our public and that kind of thing. Do we feel a need to include any recommendations for them, or do we feel like that might be a second tier after we get through our recommendations in December? That might be something we would want to recommend looking at further on down the road, I guess was the question. And then how, I guess while CJ Phillips is up here also, do we want to recommend something regarding that expansion?
I would suggest we allow that to be a part of our discussion later on. That's going to be very involved, in my humble opinion, and there's some other things that we can address now and be very effective with it.
Probation, parole, Sheriff Ingram, that as opposed to CJ
I think
Phillips.
I think we would leave that for a later discussion.
Okay. And what about Sheriff CJ Phillips?
I am all for encouraging funding for CJ Fellows program, because our county is one of those counties that is not eligible, and I would love to see our county to be able to participate in something like that. I think it's a wonderful program and a great way to begin that process of growing your own.
So Mayor Colvin, I know you said you had a hard stop. I had some slides on next steps, if we are ready to transition to that.
Oh, yes, we can keep moving. Yes, ma'am.
Okay. So what I will do, I think that I have captured everything that y'all have talked about, but what I will do is put it all in a document, perhaps, that lays out the options for you to consider for the actual recommendation. And that can be something that we go back and forth over email. You can email me your track changes or edits or thoughts. And if I've gotten it wrong, I'll change it and send it back out to the group again so that we can work on those recommendations offline while we move on to the next training topic, or next topic, which is training, if that works for everybody. I think that we are probably all seeing how much we have to do in a short amount of time. And so I want to make sure I'm using your time wisely. So I'll put all of that together in writing and send that out to you. And then for the next steps, the question was, last time when we talked about training, what types of training changes are we talking about? And we talked about focusing on leadership training about culture, the intentionality of the training topics, ensuring some topics are mandatory, and then incentives for non-mandatory training, the things that we want people to take. Are there any specific areas that you would like research on in advance of the next meeting? Any particular areas where you feel a speaker would be particularly helpful to you for any of those areas? Okay, I'll try to look at some resources based on the ideas that we have thus far and send those out to you ahead of time. And if you think of anything, please feel free to let me know, anything else that I can try to gather for the group. I'll also note that Dr. Oliver has indicated that he would be willing to continue this conversation with us, to continue to be involved with us, to continue to speak with us and give his expertise, which I think would be great. I think he's still on the call. I've shared my screen, so I'm going to stop share.
Yes, I'm still here.
Yes, sir. And so it may be that we need to contact you offline, Dr. Oliver, with questions or thoughts, if that would be all right with you. And then certainly as we're talking about more topics in the future, have further discussions.
Okay, yeah, please do. Please reach out to me.
Thank you. And thank you for coming today.
Okay, you're welcome.
Mayor Colvin, that's all I have.
All right. Well, thank you, Dr. Oliver, again for your information and participation today. Thank you, task work group members. Thank you, support staff, Ms. Dismuke and Mr. Robinson, Ms. Towns, and others. So look forward to receiving kind of a rollout like we did last time that summarized the things that we've talked about, and then any read ahead information prior to our next meeting. And I also saw there, we typically, according to the guidance we were given earlier, try to make these at around 90 minutes. But if we need to run over, as we did today, I'm certainly inclined to it. Or if we understand that we're in hot pursuit of a major change and transformation, if we need to add another meeting to continue that, certainly open to doing whatever the work group is available to do. So, but thank you all. And if nothing else, I think that will conclude it today. So thank you all and see you next time.